Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're taking on an absolute giant of history. We're going to deconstruct the massive, monolithic image of history's absolute greatest conqueror, Alexander the Great. Now, you definitely know the name, and you know the title, right? But the actual man? Well, he's basically buried under thousands of years of legends. So we're going to dig into this by looking at the people who shaped him in life, and honestly, what's even more fascinating, the people who completely rewrote his legacy in death.
Okay, let's dive into this with a quote. "I am not afraid of an army of lions led by a sheep. I am afraid of an army of sheep led by a lion." Now, whether Alexander actually stood on a battlefield and said these exact words, or if it's just something people attributed to him later, it doesn't really matter. It hits the nail on the head for our main theme today: legendary, uncompromising leadership. Alexander didn't just command armies. He was this terrifying magnetic force of will that completely reshaped the ancient world. Here's our roadmap for the explainer today. First, the making of a king. Then, conquering the Persian Empire. Third, the Indian campaign. Fourth, the conqueror's sudden end. And finally, number 5, the evolution of a global myth. Section 1, the making of a king. It's easy to forget, but Alexander wasn't born a god. He was a mortal prince, and he was heavily molded by the really intense and honestly pretty toxic pressures of his parents, plus the incredibly rigorous intellectual training he got from his famous tutor, Aristotle. Let's look at the two radically different forces that raised him. On one side, his father, King Philip II. Philip was a brilliant military expansionist, sure, but he completely lacked personal self-control. He was a man of total excess, which the ancient Greeks actually saw as a huge lack of true masculinity and leadership. Then, on the other side, you have his mother, Queen Olympias. She was fiercely ambitious. Absolutely relentless. She pushed Alexander literally from day one to maintain this pure-blood succession so he could seize the throne. She made absolutely sure he wouldn't just end up as another forgotten prince and his father's shadow. So what did the product of all this intense pressure actually look like? Well, the Azara Herm is widely considered the real Alexander. It's a Roman copy of a bust originally sculpted by a Greek named Lysippus. And Lysippus is a huge deal because he was the only sculptor Alexander ever allowed to model him from life. Now, what's really interesting about this physical description from the historian Plutarch is how he zeroes in on these fascinating tiny details. He notes the poise of the neck, which was bent slightly to the left, and the melting glance of his eyes. I just love that. It captures the raw human elements, the physical quirks, basically, of a king who was otherwise completely obsessed with crafting a flawless, divine image of himself. It gives us a rare glimpse of the actual man behind all the PR. Moving on to Section 2, conquering the Persian Empire. As Alexander comes of age, the story just hits the gas. He steps entirely out of his father's shadow, marches right into Asia, and goes head-to-head with the absolute titan of the era, the Persian king Darius III. You can viscerally feel the reality of these clashes in the famous Alexander mosaic, which shows the completely chaotic Battle of Issus. Just look at Darius. Notice the sheer anxiety and fear. You can literally see it in his furrowed brow, his desperate outstretched arm, and those fleeing horses whipping his chariot around. It's this incredible, frozen-in-time snapshot of a massive empire suddenly realizing its era is coming to a very violent end. So why exactly did the mighty Persian Empire collapse so quickly? It really comes down to tactics. Alexander used highly disciplined, rapid deployment forces. Honestly, it was the ancient equivalent of blitzkrieg warfare. Plus, he led directly from the front lines, taking on the exact same dangers as his men. Now, contrast that directly against Darius. He relied on these vast but very traditional and undisciplined feudal units. Essentially, Alexander brought a professional, hyper-focused striking machine to the battlefield, while Darius was stuck driving an outdated juggernaut. But hey, conquest wasn't just about total destruction. Take a look at the Alexander sarcophagus. It brilliantly illustrates a completely different side of this story. Here, we actually see Macedonians and Persians hunting lions together. It's such a striking image because it highlights how Alexander actively tried to unite the East and the West through cultural collaboration and integration. He wasn't just about catastrophic military defeats. He was trying to build a brand new, blended world. Section 3, the Indian campaign. That massive ambition inevitably pushed him even further east. By 326 BC, Alexander forces his exhausted, road-weary army into the grueling Indian campaign. And this is where he runs into his most successful recorded opponent.
The cultural impact of this specific campaign is so powerful that it's still making waves thousands of years later. Here we have vintage stills from the 1941 Bollywood epic Sikandar. This movie beautifully captured the fierce, noble defiance of the Indian king Porus at the Hydaspes River. And get this, that ancient battle deeply resonated with Indian nationalism during World War II. It struck such a chord that the film was actually banned in certain British Indian Army camps.
So, the crucial point is what happened after the battle. When Alexander finally captures Porus, he asks his defeated rival how he expects to be treated, and Porus gives this absolutely legendary reply: the same way a king is treated by another king. That unyielding defiance earned him Alexander's immense respect. Instead of executing him, Alexander actually restored his kingdom. It just goes to show that even titans of war can recognize and honor true greatness in their rivals. Section 4. The Conqueror's Sudden End. But as we know, nobody outruns time. The narrative abruptly shifts here, because Alexander dies completely unexpectedly at age 32 in 323 BC, and his death instantly triggers terrifying chaos among his top generals, who are suddenly left scrambling without a clear heir.
To really put his life into perspective, just look at the blistering speed of his 13-year command. In 334 BC, he crosses the Hellespont. Just 2 years later, he holds all of Egypt. By 326, he's fighting deep in India. And then bam, in 323, he's gone. I mean, think about that. He conquered the entire known world in roughly the time it takes most people to finish grade school. That is just insane pacing. But despite his ridiculously short life, the actions he took laid the actual foundations for our modern world. He created the first massive international trade network, which arguably planted the seeds for global capitalism. He spread Greek ideas like democracy and astronomy far and wide. And that incredible cultural fusion he championed, it influenced global architecture for centuries, which you can still see in places like the Great Mosque of Damascus. Plus, generals today are literally still studying his military tactics. And that brings us to Section 5, Evolution of a Global Myth. This is the real climax of our explainer today, because Alexander's actual historical life is completely overshadowed by his astonishing afterlife in cultural mythology. As a historical figure, he died. But as an icon, he absolutely refused to die. Let's move to this breakdown and see how this myth builds across completely different cultures. In the Greek tradition, he's simply the son of Philip out for glory. But in the Persian and Islamic traditions, this wildly popular text called the Alexander Romance completely remixed history. In Persian lore, they rewrote him as the secret son of their own King Darabam, born to a Greek princess who was cured by a pungent herb called sandar, literally making him al-Sandar, a legitimate Persian heir. No way, right? And in Islamic tradition, he becomes Dhul Qarnayn, a figure on a divine monotheistic mission. He wasn't a foreign invader anymore. He belonged to them. Now, we definitely need to explicitly delineate the historical record from the legendary folklore here. History tells us a straightforward story. He defeats Darius, he builds some trade routes, and he dies in Babylon. Simple. But the folklore? It says he journeyed to the literal land of darkness, searching for the water of life, and that he built a massive iron wall to hold back the apocalyptic forces of Gog and Magog. So you can see how the memory of Alexander was radically and magically rewritten to serve the specific spiritual and cultural needs of later empires. You can actually see this visual transformation happen in artifacts like these 14th century Islamic tapestries. They show his old tutor Aristotle openly weeping at Alexander's coffin. In these traditions, Alexander wasn't just some brutal warlord sweeping across the map. He was transformed into a highly revered sage and prophet, heavily guided by Aristotle's philosophy. Basically, Islamic wisdom literature elevated him into the ultimate perfect man. And the myths didn't just make him a prophet, they added some really fantastic layers of personality, including this completely surprising, tasteful humor. For instance, in Persian storytelling, right before their big battle, Darius supposedly sends Alexander a polo mallet, a ball, and a bag of sesame seeds. He's basically taunting him, saying, "You're just a kid, go play a game, plus my army is as huge as this bag of sesame." So how does Alexander reply? He sends back a single bushel of mustard seeds. His message? My army might be small, but we are deeply, intensely pungent and strong. I mean, what a comeback. It's just brilliant folklore that really enriches his reputation as a strategic genius. And finally, this mythology gifted him an incredible sense of compassion.
In Firdausi's epic Persian poem, the Shahnameh, there's this deeply poignant scene where Alexander finds Darius dying, having been betrayed and murdered by his own men. Alexander actually weeps, cradles Darius's head, and begs him to stand up so he can restore his kingdom. So Persian literature took this ruthless foreign conqueror and totally transformed him into a compassionate, legitimate heir honoring his fallen Persian brother.
Which brings us to the ultimate question we have to ask ourselves after looking at all of this. Did Alexander's greatest conquest happen on the physical battlefield, or did it happen in the minds of the people who continually rewrote his history? Because honestly, perhaps his true immortality isn't found in the empires he violently destroyed, but in his endless, shape-shifting evolution as a global myth. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. I really hope this leaves you with a whole new way to view history's most famous king. Keep questioning the past.